Well, we're back, and we'll now recognize our second panel. Mr. Ronald Haberman is the Alaska District Manager for the United States Postal Service. Ms. Tammy Whitcomb is Deputy Inspector General for the Postal Service Office of Inspector General. Mr. Dennis Devaney is Deputy Director of the Office of Aviation Analysis in the Office of Aviation and International Affairs at the Department of Transportation. Mr. Steve Deaton is Senior Vice President at ACE Air Cargo, and Mr. Jeff Butler is Vice President of Customer Service, Airports and Cargo for Alaska Airlines. Pursuant committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn in before they testify. Would you please rise and raise your right hand, please? That was 2 pleases. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Let the record reflect that all the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Y'all may be seated. We've received your written testimony, so in order to allow time for discussion, please try to limit your testimony to 5 minutes. Your entire written statements are part of the record. You should see in front of you a red, yellow, and green light. Much like when you're driving, green means you're doing good, yellow means hurry up, and red means stop. So we will now start our testimony with Mr. Haberman. You're recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Good afternoon, Chairman Farenthold and members of the committee. My name is Ronald Haberman, and I serve as the District Manager of the Postal Service's Alaska District. I have been employed by the Postal Service for 29 years, and I have been a resident of Alaska for nearly 18 years. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling this important hearing on Alaska bypass service. I am pleased to be here today to provide a historical overview of bypass mail delivery in Alaska and to explain how the current system works. I will also discuss the differences between Alaska bypass mail and standard post, previously known as parcel post, and some of the costs associated with bypass service. The state of Alaska is vast in geography, with no roads connecting the majority of its communities. Mail is transported via airplanes, helicopters, hovercraft, and ferries. While a very limited road system allows some areas to be reached by surface vehicles, nearly all mail must at some point be transported by air in order to reach its final destination. Bypass mail service came into existence in the early 1970s when increased parcel post volume, which at that time included mail delivered to bush communities, began to exceed the Postal Service's operational facility and infrastructure capacities. Bypass mail is prepared by an authorized shipper, tendered directly to mainline and bush carriers, and then delivered to the addressee at final destination. Items that flow through the bypass process are not collected, transported, or delivered by the Postal Service. These items bypass originating and destinating postal operations, thereby incurring no cost for Postal Service infrastructure, such as labor, facilities, processing, and equipment. The Department of Transportation is the sole rate-making authority for all intra-Alaska mail transportation. Alaska is the only remaining regulated air environment, which means the Postal Service is not authorized to negotiate rates directly with air carriers except under limited circumstances. There are stark differences between bypass mail and standard post. Standard post consists of single packages that must adhere to weight and size restrictions and enters the Postal Service system via contact with postal retail or delivery employees. The packages are processed and delivered within the Postal Service's infrastructure. Alaska bypass service consists of goods and commodities that are similar to freight and cargo that is shipped in bulk on pallets to rural communities. The pallet far exceeds the Postal Service maximum weight limit of 70 pounds and are prepared in a warehouse and inducted into air carrier facilities for transportation and delivery. Alaska bypass service allows businesses, which typically include popular big box wholesalers with locations in Anchorage and Fairbanks, to ship directly to rural customers, usually rural retail merchants, schools, and medical clinics, using a hub-and-spoke system. These recipients order goods and supplies from an approved bypass shipper who processes the order and tenders it to an approved bypass air carrier based at acceptance point airports in Anchorage or Fairbanks. The assigned bypass air carrier transports the order to a hub community where the large pallets are tendered to bush air carriers who deliver the items to the recipients. Goods shipped via bypass mail must be ordered from authorized shippers in minimum quantities of 1,000 pounds, and bypass pallets generally travel the same routes and in the same planes as Priority Mail Express, and first-class mail. The minimum shipping price for a bypass mail order is $365. Last year, 87.5 million pounds of bypass mail was delivered. The Postal Service incurred $109 million in transportation costs and $32 million in revenue for bypass mail service in fiscal year 2013. This means that bypass mail costs exceeded revenue by $77 million. However, transporting mail to customers and post offices in remote areas of Alaska is a part of the Postal Service's universal service obligation. Although the measures the Postal Service takes to deliver to remote areas of Alaska are unique, operating delivery services to some locations at a loss are not. For instance, the Postal Service loses money transporting mail to customers at the bottom of the Grand Canyon using mule trains. Nonetheless, as part of the Postal Service statutory mission to provide prompt, reliable, and efficient service to all communities, these addresses must receive the same level of commitment to delivery as all others across the United States. Bypass mail is a cost-effective and efficient way to handle items that would otherwise require processing through the postal infrastructure. If the Postal Service were to process bypass mail through in-house operations, it would incur substantial transportation, facility, and labor cost. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my remarks. I would be pleased to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, and you gave back some time. Always a winner with that. We'll now go to the Deputy Inspector General for the Postal Service, Ms. Tammy Whitcomb. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, Alaska Bypass is a unique service not provided anywhere else in the country. It was created in 1972 to ease operational bottlenecks, but has come to resemble a freight service rather than typical mail or parcel delivery. As you can see on the screens, under the program, large orders weighing a minimum of 1,000 pounds are shipped on pallets via air transportation. The Postal Service's normal weight limit for parcels is 70 pounds. The Alaska Bypass pallets of goods travel from the commercial warehouse via the airline to the merchant's door, bypassing the Postal Service's infrastructure. The Postal Service is required to pay for this air transportation. However, postage is assessed at less than $30 for every 70 pounds and has no relation to the actual cost. The Postal Service has lost money on Alaska Bypass every year since its inception. In 2013, the Postal Service paid out $108 million for Alaska Bypass transportation, while it brought in only $32 million in revenue, losing $76.8 million. Keeping the program consistent with its original intent has been challenging. For example, in the late 1980s, the Postal Service began prohibiting shipments of concrete and certain building materials after excesses emerged. In 2002, the program goals were formally expanded to include supporting Alaskan passenger and freight air transport. Thus, the program has evolved beyond improving Postal Service operations. The Postal Service is also restricted in how it operates the program. Changing the bypass network requires 12 months of public notice and consultation with the government of Alaska. Additionally, in a throwback to the days before airline deregulation, the law mandates that the Postal Service pay air carriers non-competitive rates set by the Department of Transportation. The Postal Service is required to equitably share bypass volume among designated carriers, and new carriers must overcome significant hurdles to participate. These features burden the Postal Service with additional costs unrelated to the postal mission. Alaska is an enormous state with few roads and many communities accessible only by air. We are sympathetic to states facing infrastructure challenges, but national and state infrastructures are typically financed by the federal government and the states. Under the current bypass program, significant support to Alaska's transportation infrastructure is paid for by postage sales outside Alaska. Postage revenues are collected from postal customers, not taxpayers, and the Postal Service has a duty to collect only such revenues as are needed to provide each service. Programs that do not pay for themselves require cross-subsidization from other products and customers, which is normally prohibited for the Postal Service. Moreover, our research suggests that Alaskans buying goods shipped through Alaska Bypass do not appear to benefit from this transportation subsidy. For example, in the towns our staff visited, a tube of toothpaste cost $1.10 more than in Anchorage, even though shipping costs through the bypass program were as low as 14 cents. Also, the University of Alaska Fairbanks has found that the same basket of groceries can cost more than twice as much in some bypass hubs than in Anchorage. One possible reform is to end Alaska Bypass and return freight shipment to the private sector. If Congress wishes to retain Alaska Bypass, we developed several options for consideration. The Postal Service could be given freedom to operate Alaska Bypass more efficiently by ending the 12-month notice and consultation period. Statutory restrictions that prevent new carriers from entering the market and that restrict competition could be removed. The Postal Service could charge higher rates to make the Alaska Bypass self-sufficient and eliminate its burden on other postal customers. Alternatively, the federal government or the state of Alaska could reimburse the Postal Service for its Alaska Bypass losses. The Alaska Permanent Fund, which was established to invest Alaska's oil and mineral revenues, has a balance of almost $50 billion that earns interest. The postal losses from Alaska Bypass would be just 2.6% of the nearly $3 billion that the fund earned last year. Delivering mail and parcels anywhere in the United States, regardless of geography, is the Postal Service's primary responsibility to the American people. But this universal service obligation has no relation to Alaska Bypass. Reforming the program should not affect universal mail and parcel services to Alaskans or to any other American. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. We'll now recognize the Deputy Director of the Office of Aviation Analysis for the Department of Transportation. That would be Mr. Dennis Devaney. Devaney, it's correct, right? If you could make sure your microphone is on, please, sir. Just press the talk button. And,
okay, I'm not good at this.
and you need to bring the microphone a little bit closer. We're all dying to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, I'm sure, yeah. And I sat on my glasses yesterday. My wife found 10-year-old glasses, so I can barely see. But in any event, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the committee. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. Am I too loud?
No, you're great. You're knocking it out of the park.
Okay, I'm not good at this, so I don't know. I'm not good at it. DOT is required by statute to set intra-Alaska mail rates. I could read what the statute says, but you guys probably already know it. I've done written testimony. It's fairly detailed and boring, and so I'll try and kind of just do an overview here. First of all, the rates we set have nothing to do with price of stamps. Doesn't have anything to do with you put a stamp on a mail. It's the rates we set are what the airlines, what the Postal Service pays to the airlines to carry a ton of mail a mile or whatever distance. When Congress deregulated the airlines in 1978, and they said anybody can charge, fly wherever they want, charge whatever they want, an exception was made for intra-Alaska mail rates. The mail system in Alaska comprises both what we consider regular mail, which is where you put a stamp on a mail, and bypass, which is the focus, obviously, of this hearing. And bypass takes its name from the fact that it bypasses the Postal Service. They don't take physical possession of the mail. If a shipper from a big box store, as I think Mr. Haberman mentioned earlier, wants to send something to Bethel, from Anchorage to Bethel, they contact the Postal Service. The Postal Service will say, give it to Carrier A or Carrier B, depending on who had the last shipment. We set, there's two elements to the mail rate, basically, what we call the terminal charge and the line haul charge. Terminal charge means how much does it cost to get a ton of mail on this airplane, irrespective of distance. You got to get a forklift, you got to do something to get it on the plane. The line haul is how far does it fly, and that costs fuel, it costs pilots, maintenance, and so on. And those are the two rates we set. It's a terminal and a line haul. Originally, when we took this responsibility over, and it's been a number of years, we conducted an exhaustive study to try and differentiate between the cost of carrying mail, the cost of carrying cargo, passengers. Passengers that walk onto an airplane. Mail doesn't. Mail can offload cargo if the plane is overloaded. In any event, we went through an exhaustive study, established what we call base rates. Since then, we've done an update. much like you'd update with this consumer price index or any other index. We don't use CPI, we use cost per available ton mile. So the assumption in our methodology is that if the cost, if the unit cost of flying an airplane in Alaska goes up 2%, the mail rates go up 2%. If they go down 1%, costs go down 1%. The only other refinement, if I can call it that, we've done to that, I think it was in 1999, we did a fuel surcharge when fuel was going up steadily. Now we do quarterly fuel surcharges, so we adjust the rate. Other than that, we set the rates every year, and it's a fully transparent process. We issue we call it a show cause order. It says, this is what we think the rates should be. We have all the underlying data, costs, unit costs, and people can, say they have an opportunity to object if we've done our arithmetic wrong, or if we've done something else wrong, and then we take those comments, of course, into consideration, and then we issue a final order, and that's it for the next year, and then we do it annually. So I hope I helped.
Great overview of the process. We appreciate your enlightening us. Our next witness is Mr. Steve Deaton, Senior Vice President at ACE Air Cargo. Mr. Deaton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members of the committee, for allowing me to come have this opportunity to talk to you today. I've submitted my written testimony, and I've decided to take a little bit of a different tact in my summary. I wouldn't want to bore you with the continuing to talk about the uniqueness of Alaska. It's no doubt it is unique. I think the committee recognizes that, and the people have been pointing that out because it's very important. I think one of the things that I'd like to talk about is the fact that it sounds like the committee and Congressman Issa and even the Senate through Senator Begich's comments the goal here isn't to do away with the bypass mail program. It has the support of the committee and the congressman and the senator. And therefore, I'd like to talk a little bit about the efficiencies, the competition, the ways to make the system better. And while I agree that the bypass mail system is not broken, I do have some thoughts on the Rural Service Improvement Act, what it's accomplished and what it is currently doing to the system and the Postal Service as a whole. A lot of the testimony today is focused on what I would call mainline air carriers. I was involved for 30 years as a retired Postal Service person now. I was around when bypass mail was rolled out, when the Bethel experiment happened. I managed that process for 25 years. I have submitted my bio. I'm here today as Senior Vice President of ACE, but I'm talking to you more as from my postal and my 50-year residency in Alaska as my base rather than my current career job. The issues as I see them: ensuring passenger service, ensuring freight service for the residents of Alaska, and trying to create efficiencies and cost savings or loss avoidance for the Postal Service seem to be what's the important thing today. Most of the discussion being mainline carriers. The Rural Service Improvement Act, when it was enacted, there were 3 mainline carriers up to that point that carried passengers: Revolution Airways, Era Aviation, and Alaska Airlines. Today, under the Rural Service Improvement Act, there are there are still 3 mainline passenger carriers carrying mail and bypass mail: Era Alaska, Alaska Airlines, and Penn Air. I think it's important to know that the majority of the Postal Service losses don't come from the mainline side. They come from the bush air carrier side, the small carriers that fly mail around the state of Alaska. prior to the Rural Service Improvement Act, there were as many as 35 air carriers. The Rural Service Improvement Act was enacted and to protect the passenger freight service, and it's done its job. There are now 9 bypass bush carriers left carrying mail in the state. There are still 3 mainline passenger carriers. In addition, there are 3 mainline cargo carriers. The mainline industry, in my opinion, is not the issue. On the bush side, where the majority of postal losses occur, there are some things in the Rural Service Improvement Act that could be improved to provide competition, increase it, and to provide efficiencies. One of those things is called the pool concept. As the Congressman referred to earlier, the Postal Service has to give the majority of its mail on the bush side to over 200 destinations to the carriers that carry and qualify for passenger carriage, who have the least amount of capacity to move it. Currently today, there's more mail transfer from bush carrier to freight carrier or bush carrier to bush carrier than there was before the Rural Service Improvement Act. If the pool concept were either eliminated or altered, then it would allow for greater competition. There would not be monopoly markets, which there are today in bush Alaska, and the unit cost for bush carriers that is used by the DOT to set rates would have a downward pressure on the Postal Service's costs. Another element that could be improved would be the equalization policies of the DOT, either straight equalizations or composite equalizations, the latter which brings an immediate savings to the Postal Service by eliminating one of the terminal handling fees that Mr. Devaney talked about. Equalizations bring more competition, both from acceptance point to hub and certainly from acceptance point to bush point, and more efficiencies, along with better service to the communities and lower cost to the Postal Service. I thank you for this opportunity to share some of my thoughts.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deaton. We'll now hear from the Vice President of Customer Service of Airports and Cargo for Alaska Airlines, Mr. Jeff Butler.
Good afternoon, Chairman Issa, Ranking Member Cummings, Chairman Fahrenholt. My name is Jeff Butler, and I do serve as the Vice President of Customer Service Airports and Cargo and Reservations for Alaska Airlines, and I'm genuinely appreciative of the opportunity to testify today on the importance of the bypass mail system to the state of Alaska. It's been interesting listening to the deficit conversation thus far this morning, because I agree with Mr. Deaton. 75% of that issue really is between the hub locations and the bush, not mainline, which has been the testimony thus far and the crux of this bill. Nonetheless, the vital importance of this program really can be summarized in one sentence. It provides rural Alaskans with access to fresh food and basic supplies which otherwise they could not afford to pay if they had to pay higher air freight prices. Statements to this subcommittee by the Yukon-Kuskokwim Health Corporation, the mayor of the North Slope Borough, and other Native organizations confirm the dire consequences in these remote communities if there are changes to the bypass mail system. Alaska Airlines, the largest air carrier in the state of Alaska, has been a significant mainline bypass carrier and respectfully disagrees with H.R. 4011. That legislation could create negative effects among all of the mainline bypass carriers, stakeholders, most importantly, the residents of the state's most isolated villages and regional communities, as well as the United States Postal Service and the existing bypass mail carriers. The only beneficiaries of H.R. 4011 would be the 3 or so new entrant bypass mail carriers that the legislation would make eligible. It would transform the entire bypass mail system and lead to reduced bypass mail and passenger service levels. It would jeopardize the rural community's fragile transportation infrastructure and drive the United States postal costs even higher. The economic reality is that the bypass mail market has been shrinking because of outmigration from the rural communities and other recent changes in the program itself. Alaska Airlines' January 2014 bypass mail volumes were 13% lower than January 1 year ago. The resulting reduction in revenue is already straining the ability to maintain the level of regularly scheduled mail, freight, and passenger service we have long operated to rural communities. The significant bypass mail revenue diversion resulting from additional new bypass mail carriers would almost certainly oblige Alaska to materially reduce the level of both its passenger as well as bypass mail service within the rural communities. The Alaska Native organizations emphasize the serious negative effects on the rural communities from such service reductions. We strongly encourage this subcommittee to bear in mind that an important objective of the 2002 Rural Services Improvement Act expressly provided that the use of the bypass mail system be used to support passenger as well as mail service to the isolated rural communities. Operating bypass service is costly. The towns do not maintain their own airport terminals like most of the lower 48. In Nome, Kotzebue, Barrow, Bethel, Alaska Airlines built those terminals. Alaska Airlines maintains those terminals on both the passenger, cargo, and mail facilities. These are really small towns of 2,000 to 4,000 residents, serving even smaller outlying villages. The resulting economic challenges of operating to these communities long ago established a clear need for a program like bypass mail. The suggestion that the system is broken that we spoke of earlier would somehow benefit with the addition of more carriers just simply does not comport with the facts. The bypass mail market is not a typical aviation market which positively responds to the addition of new carriers. It is a market that is declining, and there appear to be few prospects for meaningful growth. There is no possibility of market growth from price stimulation. Parcel post rates are set by the USPS with the approval of the Postal Rates Commission. If these parcel post rates that the shippers pay directly to the United States Postal Service and which the rural residents then indirectly pay in the form of commodity prices. With a flat to declining market and price uniformity, the addition of 3 or so new bypass mail carriers could only lead to one result: the decrease in each of the 4 bypass mail carriers' approximate market share from 25% to just 14%. That substantial bypass mail reduction has to translate into reduced levels of Alaska Airlines passenger and freight service, in addition to reduced bypass mail service among the 4 existing mainline bypass carriers. The United States Postal Service would also experience significantly worse financial results if new operators of smaller, less efficient aircraft became bypass mail participants. Those negative results would directly flow from the application of the DOT's long-standing rate-making formula establishing the rates the USPS must pay the bypass mail carriers for transporting mail. The proliferation of new entrants, smaller, less efficient aircraft would unquestionably increase flying costs. The magnitude of that substantial increase is apparent. A simple comparison of the flying capacity unit costs of Era Aviation, one of the prospective new entrants, and the same cost of Alaska Airlines shows that Era's available ton-mile cost for its smaller propeller aircraft is $1.92, in sharp contrast to Alaska's Boeing 737 ton-mile cost of just 57 cents, a 236% spread. The fixed warehouse cost component would also increase because of the corresponding reduction in each carrier's bypass mail volume. Under DOT's formula, warehouse costs are computed on the basis of the number of tons of bypass mail each carrier transports. A 42% reduction in per-carrier bypass mail volume means that the same fixed warehouse costs have to be spread over far fewer tons, thus driving up the per-ton warehouse-related expenses. The result will only further weaken the USPS's financial condition. So on behalf of the people of rural Alaska, we urge this subcommittee to not advance H.R. 4011. Thank you.
Thank you very much. To express my gratitude for everybody for their testimony. We'll now take a few moments for questions. I'll start out by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. And I'd like to say up front, I really do appreciate this group enlightening this committee and me in particular. The last time I was in Alaska was 5 years before I was elected to Congress, and I was much more interested in where the salmon were biting than how the mail in goods got delivered to rural areas. I'd like to start with Mr. Haberman, and I want to make sure, I'm going to take the 30,000-foot view of this. This bypass mail system is something that's completely different than the Postal Service offers anywhere else. Our idea of universal service is you get your bills, you get your catalogs, and you get your packages delivered anywhere in the U.S. And there's a 70-pound limit on what the Postal Service will deliver through the regular mail. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And bypass mail is only available in Alaska, and would you say it's more akin to something like a truck line or a freight company, or even a air freight company like FedEx or Atlas or somebody might do?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think it's important to remember that even though it's called bypass, it is mail. The pieces in those pallets that you see have to be prepared per our DMM regulations.
Right, but we could say we're not going to play this game anymore, and just Alaska would have no different service than everybody else from the mail system if we completely got out of bypass mail. This is something special we're doing for Alaska.
Well,
Yes. Yeah, I mean, if I were to walk into the post office with that, I couldn't mail it from Corpus Christi to Washington.
that is correct, sir, but you have to remember that each one of those individual pieces you could mail, and those were the pieces that were in the parcel post lines going through the postal infrastructure prior to bypass mail. They're simply combined on the pallets for ease of transportation.
All right, so 40 years ago, there might not have been as many options for getting that, but we're getting away from it. I just wanted to make sure we were clear that this is something that's unique to Alaska. We don't offer it in Hawaii, where it's difficult to get from island to island, or from the to Guam. It's only within Alaska.
Bypass mail service, yes, sir.
Okay, and so let me go to Mr. Devaney from the Department of Transportation. You guys set these rates for this. I mean, y'all used to set rates for passenger air travel. It was all regulated. What happened when y'all quit regulating that? Did rates go down and lots of new service come up, and good things generally happened? Yeah, microphone, please. Microphone, please, sir.
I don't know. Okay. Yeah, I was at the Civil Aeronautics Board when airlines were deregulated. We used to tell airlines where to fly, how much to charge for passengers, how much to charge for cargo, how much to charge for mail, and so on, and it was deregulated. They didn't just flip a switch. It did take. But intra-Alaska mail rates were unique, and they.
Sure, it's a statutory creation.
Yes.
I get that. And let's talk a little bit, part of what we've heard is that this was designed also to help out passenger service. Aren't there other programs like that the Department of Transportation has to subsidize air service to remote airports?
Yes, there's the Essential Air Service Program, which I'm also.
Right, and so this is basically subsidizing Alaska Airlines at the expense of postal customers. So when I go buy a Forever stamp and put it on my, Valentine card to my wife, a small portion of that is going to subsidize delivering Diet Coke to remote Alaska.
Well, I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, okay.
First-class mail is
Right, but I mean, it's coming from the Postal Service. I guess I could ask that to Ms. Whitcomb. Is that an accurate statement that, one whatever of a cent of every stamp I buy goes to help subsidize this?
Right, yes, I think that's fair.
And so, Congress could, I'm going to just say, I think Congress, if we wanted to appropriate money for this, that's great, but do we really need to hide it within what folks do for stamp? One of the other things we heard earlier was there was a concern about the safety of these new carriers. Mr. Devaney, you're in the DOT. I mean, there's a news story whenever there's a airline accident, whether it's passenger or freight. I mean, there's usually a news story. Do we have a problem with safety of any of our carriers in this country?
Mr. Chairman, I don't work for FAA. I'm in DOT.
Yeah.
Is this on?
Yeah, it's on.
I still don't know how this thing works.
Mr. Beller, you work for Alaska Airlines.
You need to get the mic closer to you there.
I'm sorry, I'm not in FAA.
All right, well, I'll go to Mr. Beller. He's in the industry. I'm sure y'all watch accidents for every carrier for lessons learned. I mean, do we have a safety problem anywhere within the U.S. aviation system?
I wouldn't necessarily say so, but I do believe that the conversation earlier this morning was more focused on the very unique climate and terrain that you do fly within the state of Alaska, and that does take a particular skill level.
We've certainly found that some of the carriers coming into Washington don't have that skill level based on the number of flights that have been canceled over the past couple of days.
I think where I was headed with that was that there are certainly any number of navigation systems that are on a lot of those airplanes that, in fact, our planes do have. And not all of those types of aircraft that Chairman Issa was referencing earlier have that. And all of that affects the delivery time and delivery strain or
Right.
the timeline of how you get.
But I mean, if that becomes necessary, the next-gen stuff, the ADS-B type stuff could be, they're pretty much available for any airplane. I mean, you can buy it.
They're not available for usage at all of the mainline airports in Alaska yet, but that's true.
Well, that's a problem we can deal with over on the Transportation Committee, and believe me, that's something we're working on. I see I've already gone over time, and I'll apologize to Mr. Cummings and give him an extra minute 40 for his question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. According to the Inspector General, Congress passed the Rural Service Improvement Act of 2002 because carriers in Alaska were focusing on providing services to the bypass routes that were the most profitable rather than on providing broad passenger service. That created the equitable tender system and gave statutory preferences to those mainline carriers providing service before January 2001. The Act also set high barriers to entry to any new carriers seeking to enter the mainline market. Mr. Haberman, just so we have the basic facts, can you quickly explain how these provisions work? What advantages do carriers that were providing bypass service before January 2001 have over new entrants? And what are the specific conditions new entrants must meet to carry bypass?
Congressman, I think the best way to answer that is in RISA, there are some hurdles that a carrier would have to live up to in order to enter that pool. And if I recall correctly, they have to provide service for 36 months in the marketplace. They also have to have a passenger load capability of 75% of the other carriers. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's a pretty high hurdle. Would you consider that a pretty high hurdle to get over?
I couldn't comment on that, sir. I'm not in the airline.
All right, well, why don't we go to the Inspector General? The Inspector General's white paper criticized this provision of the Rural Service Improvement Act, saying that it provided protection for the 5 existing mainline carriers. Ms. Wickham, does the IG still stand by that position?
Yes, we do.
And why is that?
We believe that the situation as it stands results in increased costs to the Postal Service because of the limitations of the 5 air carriers and the hurdles that you spoke of earlier.
Well, now, the IG report's recommending changing the law to eliminate the statutory restrictions placed on new entrants to both the mainline and bush markets. Ms. Wickham, is it your contention that allowing additional carriers to enter this market would drive down the cost of the Postal Service?
We believe that there would be some impact to the reductions in the cost of the Postal Service. And that was one of the options, one of the suggestions in the report. We had several others as well that could be considered.
And what effect might the entry of additional carriers to the bypass market have on passenger service in Alaska, particularly with regard to the remote regions?
It's a complex system, as you know, and as we've discussed here on the panel. We talk about, I think in the report, about how the increased competition in the international rates has resulted in reduced cost. And so we were kind of looking to that as a model. But it is, again, it's a complex system, and this was one suggestion as a possible option to look at related to mail bypass.
Is it the Attorney General's position that we shouldn't have a bypass system?
I don't think we've stated that that's our
I'm asking
position.
you, what do you think? I'm just curious. I mean, I understand that this system was put together because of a unique situation.
Right.
And there have been allegations earlier that the Constitution requires that we have this. Do you agree with that? Some kind of system like this?
We believe universal service is an appropriate role for the Postal Service. This though, in many cases resembles more of a freight type of service versus a mail kind of service. So that's the way that we looked at it in our paper and how we did our evaluation.
Go ahead.
I think asking about whether we believe it's appropriate to have an Alaska bypass at all, program at all, I'm not sure that we came down on whether that is appropriate or that we have a position on the appropriateness. We believe it serves a purpose for the citizens of Alaska, that it's evolved into a very important role in the state of Alaska. We do have many concerns, though, about the Postal Service's role in kind of subsidizing the system.
Now, you were in the room when the senator and the congressman testified a little bit earlier, were you not?
Yes.
Were you here? Mm-hmm. And you heard them say that the legislation that we passed out of our committee a week or so ago, they claim that what it would do is it would cost more, a lot more. And do you agree with that? Obviously, you don't.
We have not done a thorough analysis of that. It's a very complex system, as I said. We don't believe that it would cost more, but again, I'm certain as to what they're relying on, what numbers they're relying on to come to that conclusion.
Now, Mr. Haberman, in February 2014, the committee did consider H.R. 4011, the Alaskan Bypass Fair Competition Act of 2014. What is the Postal Service's understanding of exactly what this legislation would do?
I believe the Postal Service attorneys are still looking at that legislation, sir, so I can't offer an opinion at this time.
Well, is the Postal Service aware of air carriers that are seeking to enter the bypass market?
We believe there are some carriers that would like to be in the bypass market, yes, sir.
I mean, have they approached you all? I'm just curious.
They have talked to some of our representatives in the Alaska District. I don't know who they are specifically.
And could the carrier or carriers meet the 36-month performance standard?
I can't answer that, sir. I can certainly go back and verify that and provide an answer for the record.
And Mr. Butler, what is Alaska Air's position on H.R. 4011?
As I stated earlier.
Keep your voice up, please.
Yes, as I stated earlier, we disagree with it. And I think Mr. Haberman's paper that he submitted in advance, where it says this is the most cost-effective process and program there is our opinion. Mm-hmm. It works today.
And Mr. Deaton, what is ACE Air's position on the legislation?
ACE believes that there are sufficient barriers in entry to intra-Alaska bypass mail transportation, other than requiring 36 months or having a 12/1/2001 date. The requirement is 12 months service, not 36 months service, between any 2 points within the state of Alaska. And there's also a requirement of performing that 12 months with equipment of the size either mainline or bush that you're going to be continuing once you qualify for. Those hurdles, along with the certification process by the FAA, are extremely strenuous, both from a certification and regulatory process as well as from an economic process, because even once a mainline carrier gets past its 12-month hurdle of intra-Alaska service, which was written in there specifically to give it the experience from a safety standpoint of flying within Alaska, that carrier then needs to provide 75% of the seats in whatever market it's determined it wants to begin carrying passengers in, for matching 75% of the insured seats offered by the incumbent. That economic barrier, in addition to 12 months of flying within the state of Alaska, make it extremely difficult. And to my knowledge, there are no mainline carriers that are seeking bypass mail entry.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Cummings. We'll now go to the chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from California, Mr. Issa.
Thank you. There's been a lot of talk about killing bypass mail as though there's anything in either of these bills that intends to do it. Mr. Haberman, you talked about this being the most efficient system. What does that have to do with this legislation? Aren't we attempting to make this system more efficient? In other words, you contrasted in your opening statement as seemingly parcel post or the post office getting involved in this delivery versus not getting involved. Nothing in this legislation puts the postal system back into the picture, does it?
Not that I'm aware of, sir.
So I was a little perplexed because from a postal standpoint, you simply take the bill that Mr. Devaney gives you indirectly and pay it. You collect a fraction of the revenues that it takes to operate it. So you collect $36 million and you pay out $100 and some million. That's really all you're doing, right?
That's the way the system is.
Okay, so you're calling this an efficient system, and I'm a little perplexed that you're calling it an efficient system. Mr. Devaney, when you look at the cost of the various carriers, did the cost of operation of the various carriers vary?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, they do.
Okay.
What we do, and I was...
Well, let's just go through real quickly, because I want to allow a lot of time for you to answer, but I'm looking at revenue ton prices. You pay Alaska Airline, from what I can tell, $2.13 or 2014 per ton mile as of March 4th, 2014, because they're a mainline non-priority bypass carrier, I believe. Mainland priority, you would pay them $3.53 per ton mile. A bush pilot under Part 121, which is a scheduled airline bush pilot, you pay $5.74 a ton mile. And then a Part 135, you pay almost $15 a ton mile. And a bush seaplane. Now, I suspect that these guys don't have advanced equipment and fancy terminals when they land on the lake or the ice. You pay $32.59 per ton mile. Those figures sound familiar?
Yes, sir. Yes, Mr.
Okay, so you've got all kinds of levels of efficiency in Alaska, isn't that true?
Yes.
Additionally, if I take a bush pilot, every time that bush pilot makes a terminal stop, you pay him $850 per ton that he's carrying. Is there any way that you can see that, that we could save money? For example, if they made less stops at terminals, wouldn't you save $850 per ton on a bush pilot?
Well, Mr. Chairman, the DOT is responsible for setting what we believe are the best fair and reasonable rates. We take the cost, it costs more to operate seaplanes than big planes on a per unit basis.
Right, so
Because there's salt. There's
so you take what actually occurs and you measure it, right?
Yes, sir.
And if somebody were to come in, I don't know what it is, let's just say with a Embraer, small jet, freight only, and they could do it for less money than a 737. And I'm not saying they would, but if they could, you would measure a lower amount of cost and put that into your rate calculations, right?
That's exactly correct, sir. What we do is we set, and I don't want to get too technical here, but we set what is called a class rate. You put we take the main line, for example, there's a main line class rate, and there's 4 or 5 airlines. We put all the costs into the pot, divided by all the units, and we say, okay, here's the, it's X dollars per ton and X dollars per mile that you fly the mail. Now, if your costs are above average, you're not going to make out so well. If your costs are below the average, you're going to make out fairly well. And that's the whole concept
So
of class rate.
with the current rating system, if you let 300 additional, doesn't matter, amount of competitors in, the only way it would drive up price is if those competitors came in and were less efficient, right?
Yes, I think is the answer. It gets a little more complicated, Mr. Chairman, because then you get into equalization and Bush rates and so on. But yes, certainly if the average cost, I mean, if you're going to introduce someone who has higher unit costs, that would raise the cost for the entire class.
Okay, so I think going back to Ms. Whitcomb's report, the report that the IG gave us, it sounds like, and we're doing legislation, and it's early on to a certain extent. We've got a long time to go to pass the bill, pass it out of the full House, get with the Senate, conference it. It appears as though the senator from Alaska could have comments. But Mr. Deaton, let me go through a couple of the things that you've seen in the way of efficiencies. If we were to allow the post office to look for efficiencies in consultation with the Department of Transportation's numbers, and then make selection on all carriers based not on a bid rate, so to speak, but based on a bid rate based on efficiency, thus choosing more efficient carriers or more efficient routes, in your opinion, would that save us money? You 25 years of watching this system. Could we use systems like that, empower the post office to save money by making the network more efficient?
Are you referring to moving the environment from regulated tender to actual contract bid?
Well, contract bid is certainly something that I envision as a lower 48 person. But even if we accepted for a moment this theory that you have so many people who all get access to pick up the freight, but you pay them based on a calculation of average cost, is it possible to drive down average cost by getting more efficient carriers, meaning that the carrier gets the same rate? I mean, you're with ACE, next to you is Alaska. If you tried to compete with Alaska with your aircraft, my assumption is that if they pay you the same as they pay Alaska for the same route, you wouldn't make money, or you certainly wouldn't make what they make. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. So by definition, you're only going to want to pick up freight if you can be competitive and you have a reason to be below the average against other carriers you're competing with, right?
Correct.
So now the question goes back, and this goes back to, and I'll go to the IG. When the IG looked at the inefficiencies and the ability to fix this, my understanding is what they wanted to see was the opportunity to look for cost savings. Now, Alaska Air is here, and you, without a doubt, with your 737 mixed cargo, if that cargo plane is full, you have the most efficient carrying capability, and actually both ways, because you carry salmon back and so on. The real question is, are we picking all the most efficient carriers for each route and then routing them the most efficient fashion? Mr. Deaton, you've operated there for longer than some people on the dais have been alive. Are we doing it as efficiently as we could, or can we increase efficiency, thus causing Mr. Devaney the ability to calculate a lower rate as a result of efficiencies?
I believe that could be accomplished, Mr. Chairman. I think it's first important to understand, to separate out mainline efficiencies from Bush efficiencies.
And that's been made abundantly clear that we are dealing with 3 to 4 different sub-markets, Anchorage to Bethel or Frankfurt, those, I've been those places. They have big runways, big aircraft land. To be honest, the state capital may be a small, isolated place, but it has a big runway.
That's correct. Alaska Airlines the predominant passenger carrier on the mainline side. There are 2 other passenger carriers. But it's important to understand that the mainline tender of bypass mail is a straight equitable tender. All the carriers that are qualified and are in markets receive an equitable or equal share of mail. This allows them to maximize their flight schedules, their combi versus full passenger versus all cargo, and is quite an efficient mix. The issue there in that mainline market becomes a factor of numbers in terms of bringing more mainline carriers in. Would that be more competitive? On the Bush side, it's a different.
But let me switch it around before you go off of that, because I'm a big fan of Alaska Air. I've flown them, frequent flyer and all that. But let me ask the question. The equitable question is, if we lock out alternate carriers, which current law does, and Alaska's making money on theirs, but the other carriers are carrying, not able to have access to what is effectively lucrative freight, are we in fact putting Alaska at an advantage in the passenger and other miles? You know, the locking them out of the ability to carry that, Alaska would say, well, if they can't carry all of that mail on the main line for the most part, then somehow prices are going up. The question is, wouldn't you end up with all 3 carrying the same amount of mail and adjusting their aircraft accordingly?
I believe so. That's correct. You know, the issue of mail getting on a passenger airplane, whether it's Alaska or AERA or Penn Air, after passengers and bags, means that the more efficient carrier, the higher carrier with the higher ridership, usually carries the least amount of mail because they can't enplane it. So that becomes transfer functions and moves around to carriers, the other passenger carriers that may not have the ridership, and they end up carrying the mail that was originally given to, for instance, Alaska Airlines. So it spreads itself out over an equitable basis based on who has the capacity, and at the mainline level, it tends to lend itself to a flow of mail that increases the efficiency of each carrier. There's 3 passenger carrier, 3 cargo only carrier at the mainline level. Quite frankly, in my experience and opinion, the markets, the economy in Alaska would not support any more than those. Actually, I would argue that there's probably too many as there are. There's too many freight carriers for sure. When you go to the Bush side, the issue becomes the pool concept. If you're looking for efficiencies, to give 75% of the mail to those carriers with the least capacity to carry it, and to restrict entry into monopoly markets because other passenger carriers can't get the ridership to enter, or freight carriers cannot get enough mail to enter, it not only hurts the residents of that community from a freight and passenger standpoint, but it restricts competition. So it goes in both directions.
I'm going to do a couple more questions. We'll do a second round of questions. Chairman Issa has done a good job getting down into the bush or the weeds of this. I want to get back up to 30,000 feet because this is quite a few people reading this record may not have the level of familiarity with the system that, excuse me, Chairman Issa has. And Mr. Haberman, I want to go back for a second on the history of the bypass mail. I know in my first line of question, I was pointing out there was something unique to Alaska, but it was actually born to bring Postal Service costs down, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct? I mean, rather than to meet the 70-pound limit, I could probably mail to go back to my Diet Coke example, a dozen 12-packs of Diet Coke is about all you can get in 70 pounds. Well, if I'm a retailer selling Diet Coke, I'd have to do 20 or 30 70-pound packages of 12 packs of soft drink to get what I want, and the Postal Service would have to process each one of those individually, probably palletize them themselves, contract with an air carrier to get them there. So we're actually In Alaska, I would imagine normal parcel post would be a huge loss leader for the post office. Is that correct?
I would agree with that statement, Mr. Chairman, yes.
So it actually does hold some of the costs down for the postal service. I wanted to get that side of the issue into the record. I also wanted to ask Ms. Whitcomb, there was some testimony that the legislation we're talking about would result in smaller market share as we let more carriers in. Couldn't what we do be crafted in such a way that we limit the number of carriers but have some competition among the carriers? So rather than having 25 bypass carriers, we have 5, but they bid for it competitively over a reasonable amount of time, or we could create something that wouldn't flood the market and make it fail. Now, is that not correct?
Yes, I think that would be correct.
Quite frankly, I'm not sure it's the government's responsibility to protect businesses from their own stupid mistakes, bidding on a contract that they can't keep, or an industry overbuilding its capacity. A lot of times that actually results, I think, in lower costs for consumers as they look for more efficiencies in ways to do that. So those were my personal final 2 30,000-foot questions. I'll now go to Mr. Cummings for a second round of questioning.
First of all, Mr. Chairman, I ask for unanimous consent to enter into the record letters from citizens and interest groups from Alaska concerning H.R. 4011 and the vitality of the bypass program to their community.
Without objection, so ordered.
Let me, Mr. Vaney, how often does the DOT visit Alaska and audit the carriers?
Here's my thing on. We typically, I think we go up about once a year. Whether it's officially what you would call an audit, I don't.
Well, why don't you tell me what you do?
Okay, all airlines, whether they're Alaska Airlines or United Airlines or any airline, are required to submit data to the department. It's called the Bureau of Transportation Statistics. They are auditable, just like your income tax is. I'm not sure every single one is audited, but they are subject to audit, and the airlines have to swear and declare that the data are accurate, and we use those data to set the mail rates.
And how does the DOT ensure there is no collusion between the airlines to keep the costs high?
Well, again, all the data are subject to audit. It's in a different department of DOT. It's Bureau of Transportation Statistics. They have audit checks, edit checks, and so on. They do. The Inspector General at DOT does audit carriers. I don't know what their schedule is, and they probably don't want me to know what their schedule is, but it is audited.
And the purpose of the audit, again, is what?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear your question.
The purpose of the audit
Would be to
what?
Would be to make sure that the data are accurate. And this goes far-reaching beyond Alaska mail rates. This could have to do with airline mergers, international alliances, all kinds of financial and passenger and traffic data.
At the end of fiscal year 2013, the Postal Service estimated the cost of the bypass program to be approximately $108 million. Mr. Haberman, how much of the total cost of the program goes directly to the carriers?
Those are the costs that go to the carriers, sir, so it would be 100%.
100% goes to the carriers?
Yes, sir, I believe that is the correct answer.
They receive about $32 million to the post office in revenue.
And Mr. Devaney, can you explain to the committee what the Central Air Service Program is, and can you tell us how many of the airlines participating in the bypass program also participate in the Essential Air Service Program?
Yes, sir. The Essential Air Service Program was created as part of the Airline Deregulation Act in 1978 to ensure that communities that received air service under regulation would receive it for at least 10 years after deregulation. It was extended, so that was 78 to 88. It's been extended a couple of times. The current program is roughly 160 communities where we pay an airline to provide service whereas the community would otherwise not have any air service. Of the roughly 160, I think it's about 117 in the lower 48 and 43 in Alaska. Our total bill is roughly $250 million a year. In Alaska, it's 18 million, 15 to $18 million. Frequently, what we pay a small airline to provide 1 or 2, maybe 3 round trips a week to Bethel or to Juneau or to some acceptance point where people can then go to doctor's appointments and get medicine and food and so on. So there is a little bit of interplay between the mail rates and the Essential Air Service Program. Not a lot, but.
Now, Mr. Butler, does the Alaska Airlines receive subsidies under the EAS program?
We do. None of the mainline bypass markets are EAS markets.
And if so, on average, how much does it receive?
I do not know the answer to that question.
Can you get that to us, please?
I certainly can.
Very well. I yield back.
Okay. Mr. Devaney, would you repeat the essential air subsidy in Alaska for delivering passengers to areas that otherwise wouldn't be served is how many dollars per year, roughly?
It's 43 communities currently, and it's between $15 and $18 million. I can get you the precise figure.
Okay.
Including diamide and ADAC, and I can't.
So some of the same communities that the post office is losing money delivering bypass mail to.
There is some overlap, I believe.
So if there is an essential air service subsidy, would it be fair for this legislation to say that we're not going to subsidize passenger service for those communities? In other words, the post office should be able to pick the low bidder freight only in those communities that are already subsidized by, their passengers are subsidized by passenger. In other words, if a freight only carrier can underbid on a competitive basis the rate that would otherwise exist, should a freight only carrier, Mr. Deaton, be able to bid for those lines, since obviously we're funding the passengers through another means? Because whether the Senator or the House member, Mr. Young, said so, we all understand, and I understand directly from the late Ted Stevens, that this program is intended to keep passengers getting access to communities. He made it very clear when he did the legislation that he didn't like a number of companies, including the one you work for, because you were trying to game the system by not carrying passengers. That is, I mean, I don't want to speak ill of the dead, but he understood this was why he did it, and he told me so in no uncertain words in his own office. So the question is, for each of you, including Mr. Butler, if essential service is being paid for by the Department of Transportation, providing a subsidy for passengers, is there any reason that we shouldn't pick a less expensive carrier if they're willing to carry freight only to those locations? Mr. Butler, I'll start with you.
Well, I just want to go back to my comment before. In my world, it doesn't apply because EAS is not in any of the mainline markets.
Right, so it wouldn't affect your carrier, but do you see any reason that a freight-only carrier shouldn't be able to bid freight-only in those markets where there's a subsidy? You're not receiving a subsidy for essential services, what you're saying, in the mainline markets.
I think there were other opportunities that we talked about earlier that perhaps we should explore instead. For instance, the rate-making authority that doesn't require legislation to do that. I would prefer to go down that path before I answer that question.
Okay, well, you know, one of the reasons we're having this hearing today is because in 2002, with no hearings, Senator Stevens locked out future competition as a matter of statute. And today you're objecting to H.R. 411, which simply undoes a portion of the mandate put in by the late Senator Stevens.
What I would also say in that 2002 model, that the DOT and the State of Alaska and the Northern Economic Study said that the mainline bypass mail product is more stable, more efficient than it was prior to 2002.
But okay, well, the reason for that lockout had to do with people who were trying to not carry passengers. That was the reason Senator Stevens did it. And so I understand as a passenger carrier, your preference not to have something that might allow non-passenger carriers to compete more effectively. But I still go back to the same point. What share of the market did you have in 2001?
The market in the State of Alaska is flat. It is not.
No, what share of the market did you have?
Of the freight market?
Freight or passenger, I'll take either one. What was your passenger share in 2001? What's your passenger share today?
They're pretty much the same.
What was your freight share in 2001? What's your freight share?
Pretty much the same.
Okay, so this legislation didn't affect Alaska Airs unless you...
Bypass mail is dropping for us. Freight is...
People are drinking less Diet Coke? Why is it dropping? Is it just less people living in the outer areas?
The volume year over year is down. The out-migration out of the rural communities, yes.
Or in-migration into the cities?
Somewhat. The State of Alaska is not growing greatly.
Right, so people are leaving rural Alaska, leaving Aleutian Islands, leaving Alaskan native islands, and coming into cities where they're better served.
There is certainly out-migration from the bush.
You know, they did that in the lower 48 some years ago, too. So I guess the question is, legislation in 2002 didn't seem to do anything for you except lock out competition, but your market share is roughly where it was. Your complaint is your market's smaller, right?
The market share is what it is, and the interior market has never made money for Alaska Airlines.
Okay. Do you carry mail in the lower 48?
Very limited, Los Angeles to Mexico, Los Angeles to Vancouver.
So you do carry mail?
A limited.
Do you have a monopoly on those two lines?
We do not.
So you do it with a rate schedule, and you do it because it makes you money?
Yes.
So competition isn't the problem in those two routes. I just want to understand that you can carry to Mexico and to Vancouver, and other people can carry, and you're happy to take the mail and have it as part of your profit analysis.
My concern in the State of Alaska is all on the mainline portion, what the portion that Alaska Airlines is responsible for out to the hub locations.
Okay, but if you had to bid for bypass mail, which is freight basically, because you also bid for freight, I assume, in those aircraft. Well, there was Alaska Air's 737-400s, which are split cargo passenger versions. You carry mail, you carry people, you carry bypass mail, and you carry freight.
You're correct.
Okay. And you get paid, let's say, $1 a pound for freight, you get paid $1 a pound for bypass mail, and you get paid whatever you get paid for your passengers, roughly. Okay. The difference is that, Mr. Haberman, you get paid 32 cents a pound, so to speak, to carry freight that's costing you $1.08 because of Mr. Devaney's rates on a blended basis. Is that right? I've got my numbers roughly right, but you have about $32 million of income and $108 million of outflow, and that's how you get a $76 million loss on this program, right?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, that's accurate.
Okay. So the only thing we're dealing with is not the efficiency of the program. We'll assume for a moment that the efficiency was perfect, but you're only getting paid a fraction, about 30 cents on the dollar of what it costs to do.
That's correct.
It's actually slightly less than 30, but close to 30. And I want to make sure, Mr. Devaney, your testimony today is there are some ways that we could structure or allow to be structured Alaskan bypass that would lead to your calculations being lower because of less expensive blended rates. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, yeah, we're agnostic on who should be included in the rate pool and who not. Obviously.
No, I'm not asking that. I'm asking that you calculate it, and you said that some carriers cost less and some cost more, right?
Yes, sir.
And you said under oath that if if you take the less expensive carriers and you give them more, and you take the more expensive carriers and you take them out, then your rate would drop on a blended basis, right?
I believe the blended rate would drop. There's also this equitable tender issue. So it's not like if a good restaurant opens up in your city and it's cheap and they have good food and everybody goes there, the statutes require an equitable tender. So every airline gets an equal.
Every airline that's allowed in.
Yes.
Okay, but they're locking people out, right? And they're not locking out the least efficient. They're locking out ones after a certain date of incorporation or operation, right?
I believe it's 2001 or whatever.
Okay. I just want to understand that the Senator and Congressman Young, they talked about how this whole system would fall apart and there'd be all this inefficiency and it's going to collapse if we change anything, that it's a perfect system. Mr. Butler effectively said the same thing from Alaska Airlines, that you can't change anything, it would only get worse, everything's going to cost more money. This committee is not interested in destroying bypass mail. We'd love to find somebody else to pay for it. We'd love Essential, Air Service to pay for it, but given that that's not likely to happen and it's not within our jurisdiction, all we're looking for in H.R. 4011 and in follow-on legislation we're working on today is, can we enable, not Mr. Haberman, but the people broadly behind him and so on at the Postal Service, to be empowered to find ways to authorize greater competition leading to greater efficiency in structure leading to lower cost. If we can't, then this exercise is a lot of work for $20 million in savings. We're hoping to be able to do that. My question to you is, do you see carriers that are more efficient, and as a result, if they were the only carriers in a world, would we have lower costs? And your answer is?
I mean, we'd have to look at the numbers, Mr. Chairman. Yes, if their unit costs are lower than the aggregate.
But some carriers' unit costs are lower. Okay.
Perhaps, yeah.
Right. So a process of selecting those who had the lowest unit cost, either by having them bid because they're able to do it for less, or having them, for example, if we were to allow 3 other carriers that are that as a result of changing dates or deleting dates in H.R. 4011, if we were allowing them only to enter if they could show that their cost would be favorable to the pool, in other words, they would be at or below the average, then, contrary to Mr. Butler's statement, it actually would lower costs. Is that right? If only people could enter who could prove that they would not be adverse to the rate pool were allowed to enter. Your was it Kevin's name? Your functionary, the person that works for you who actually does the calculations.
Yes, that's arithmetically correct.
I wish I'd had him. So, but I get the idea. I mean, that's one of the things in the legislation is we don't want to open up competition to get higher prices. I'm a pro-competition person because it normally leads to innovation, better products, better services, and so on. I understand aviation, even the lower 48, is more complex than just open it up, get better service. Anyone who's flown knows that deregulation wasn't all about better service. Yeah, I saw you didn't leave, Blake. Okay, so we've established that there are at least ways in which the way you calculate cost, we could have a favorable result as a result of giving the Post Office certain guidance capability.
I think that could be the result. I don't know that it necessarily.
Mr. Butler, would you agree that if somebody could carry freight and have a lower cost of delivering it, whether it's on the main line or in the bush or a hydrofoil to a remote island, that we should be able to consider adding them if they're a more efficient carrier?
I think you absolutely want to look for efficiency. I totally agree with you on that statement. Mr. Rice, I keep thinking about your time in Alaska and the instability that industry has been through, whether it be Reeve Aerolution, whether it be Wien, whether it be Alaska Airlines.
Well, let me go through a little of the history.
Unstable, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Well, I understand it's not stable. The Post Office lost $16 billion if calculated under GAAP last year, and 5 point some billion the way government calculates. That's a lot of money. We're doing a long hearing on a small part, but I'm doing it separately because I want to be fair to the Alaskans rather than the lower 48 problems, which the President has addressed better than Congress. But going back to parcel post, and I just want to make sure we get this in the record, Mr. Haberman, do you know when parcel post began in the United States?
I don't know the date, sir. I can certainly get that for you.
Now, it's 1913. And it was in reaction to the 1887 International Convention, where the world began looking at the idea of transporting packages. And they worked out a convention, and the United States entered a domestic route. Prior to that time, we didn't ship freight through the post office. The post office was a letter carrier for over 100 years. So I just want to make sure that we leave that as part of the record. I had two distinguished members of the House and Senate in front of me, and they talked about freight/package delivery as some sort of a universal entitlement. It's not. If the post office to survive is going to carry only letters, and UPS and FedEx and all these other folks have to worry about freight, that's okay. That's consistent with the Constitution and the over 100 years of all of our founders were dead by the time we carried the first parcel post, at least based on my calculation of their longevity. Mr. Butler, since Alaska Airlines was nice enough to come here, let me go through a couple more things. You're in charge of freight for Alaska Airlines, right?
The cargo division reports to me, yes.
Okay. Is the 737-400 your most efficient aircraft?
It is not.
But that's the one you use in Alaska.
It is the one that we are currently flying in the state of Alaska.
So when I fly Alaskan in the lower 48, I fly a newer, more efficient aircraft. Isn't that correct?
For passenger traffic, that's true.
Okay. And Boeing, I understand you're from Seattle. They would make you a new combo aircraft, wouldn't they?
We are in the process of looking at that today.
And if you bought probably a 737-800 type airframe combo, you would have a cap cost, but you would have a lower cost of operation, wouldn't you?
That's a true statement. That airplane would not fly to all of those mainline bypass markets, however.
I understand there's a right plane for every runway. But, Mr. Devaney, your people would, if they were calculating a more efficient airplane, would in fact pay Mr. Butler and everyone else less, right? I just want to understand that the current system rewards inefficiency to a certain extent, that if it costs more to operate, the rate goes up, and the only reason that you drive down your cost is that you want to make sure that whatever the rate is, you then make money on it, right?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I think that's essentially right. I analogize it to spaghetti sauce. You throw everything in there, you put in the spices and everything, you stir it up, and then there's an average price. And if you can keep your costs below average, you make out fairly well. If your costs are above average, you don't make out so well.
Right. Mr. Butler, you'd agree with that? Okay. Now, where else do you operate in which you operate based on that system other than Alaska, where you get compensated based on the average cost of multiple carriers?
The bypass mail product is the only product.
The only one. And, Mr. Devaney, on the give me your biggest run. Your biggest run would be Anchorage to Fairbanks?
For bypass mail?
Yeah.
Nome or Bethel.
Bethel. Okay, I've taken that run. So 400 miles, Anchorage to Bethel. How many carriers carry Anchorage to Bethel? Mr. Devaney, in the pool, and you can check with your staff, in the pool that you calculate for the run Anchorage to Bethel, how many carriers are there?
I don't know the answer, Mr. Chairman. I can certainly get that.
Okay, if you would give us for the record sort of a calculation of, at a given time and a given span, who the carriers were, A, B, C, D, I don't even care about the names, but, you know, just, and what their average cost is, so we could see the difference in the cost calculated based on people all carrying tonnage on the same route.
Be happy to get that to you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Mr. Deaton, we're considering legislation that would encourage or prioritize or try to have carriers go to basically skip ports, which are presently costing us money, and try to have them go from point to point without an interim stop. Does that save money on the route?
When authorized, the Postal Service can tender mail to a composite carrier that flies direct from an acceptance point to a bush point, and immediately, day in and day out, saves the terminal handling fee for every pound of mail that is tendered to that location. Consequently, also, that community, the residents there, also receive direct service, better mail service, better product that goes through the bypass mail. So all of those things are correct, yes.
Okay. I obviously have a keen interest in this. Between the late Ted Stevens and myself, I'm the only one left to hold a hearing on this. I've asked a lot of questions. Do any of you have any additional closing things that you think should be made for the record? Blake? Do any of you have any additional items that we didn't ask that you'd want to make sure were in the record? Mr. Deaton?
I would just like to make sure the record reflects that there's multiple components. I think we've all established the Rural Service Improvement Act, and bypass mail is a very complex system. I would totally agree, because I was involved in the development of the Rural Service Improvement Act, with the Chairman's position on why it came about and what the purpose of it was. The role was to favor passenger carriers over all other carriers. The role was to restrict entry. The role was to award bush passenger carriers more favorable mail tender than they did others. And quite honestly, it was aimed specifically in the equalization portion, was aimed specifically at one carrier at the time. That carrier is a freight carrier at the time and remains so. Your comment about efficiencies and unit costs, I'd like to also get on the record that the current law requires the DOT on the bush side to only consider passenger carrier costs when it sets rates, and it does not consider, when it sets rates, the cost and the lower unit cost of efficient freight carriers. So I would like to make sure that that's a part of the record also.
I appreciate that. Mr. Butler?
You know, my only comment is that I don't necessarily believe that the bypass mail product requires anywhere near the surgery that this bill particularly contemplates, nor the enormous risk.
Wait a second. The bill only undoes the 2002 restrictions, as far as I know. We do have some additional legislation we're looking at, and that may be more surgery than you want. But what in 4011 was so onerous to allow additional competitors that were able to be in prior to 2001?
I think a number of the things that we talked about earlier that allow for the potential for the commodity product in the bush to go high, sky high. For one, I guess primarily that one. I guess my point.
So your point on 4011 is that we should make sure that we put protections in the selection that would be allowed to prevent that. In other words, the Post Office, in consultation with the Department of Transportation, would be allowed to select carriers based on preventing the price from going up due to an adverse cost. Is that what you're saying?
No, my point is that I believe that 4011 causes a number of disruptions, but I would.
But it certainly means that people can compete against you for mainline, right?
That is true.
Okay. Is there anything you don't like about this bill other than that?
Well, I would suggest, based upon the conversation earlier, that there is an opportunity for the rate-making formula to be looked at, and that doesn't require anything related to legislation to make that happen, and that is one of the potential opportunities here.
How would the Post Office affect Mr. Devaney's absolute ability to look at price, set it, and then they have to pay it? You understand? They don't write a purchase order. They just write the check.
File a petition with the DOT.
Okay, so you're telling me that the Post Office could beg the DOT to come up with a rule to change something, but there's no legislation required?
I think that's a potential.
Mr. Haberman, have you been contemplating begging the ability to reduce the cost to the Post Office?
I'm not aware of any ability for us to
Would it be reasonable that you should have been begging for years for that?
if we would, yes, sir.
Do you think that the postmaster could get back to us and see if he's ever thought about trying to pay less?
Absolutely, sir.
I'm astounded that we're only discovering that here today, but Mr. Butler, I certainly will be working with the postal system to see if they believe there's any reasonable way that they could simply pay less. Something tells me that I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for $76 million worth of cross-subsidy going on.
I believe that the DOT has routinely changed some of those parameters, but you will discover that yourself.
Okay. Anyone else?
I'll just.
Yes, sir.
Chairman, there are provisions in statute and our own regulations that either party, either the Postal Service or airlines, can request to reopen the.
Have the airlines ever requested to reopen, try to get more money?
No, sir.
They must be doing okay, right? They're not dissatisfied, apparently.
In our world, Mr. Chairman, we want both sides to be mad at us. We want the post office and the airlines to be mad at us. Because if one side's happy, then maybe the rates are too high or too low. If they're both kind of not unhappy.
But your testimony today is you simply measure the world as it is. You're not in the business of creating efficiencies or even lobbying for efficiencies. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
And doesn't that create an odd situation in which the post office cannot force efficiencies? You're not in the business of creating efficiencies. Mr. Butler is in the business of being efficient enough to make money, but not necessarily to drive down the cost of the post office. There's no particular incentive to him, is there?
It's an unusual situation where we play referee between the airlines.
And understand, we could have called in the Bush pilot that's costing us $32 per ton per mile, plus $850 every time, $850 per ton every time he lands. We oddly enough had Alaska Airlines volunteer to come here when, without a doubt, you're flying the most efficient aircraft, large capacity aircraft to these large airports in Alaska. I mean, in a sense, Mr. Butler, I was a little surprised that you were worried as an incumbent that you wouldn't continue to compete successfully and have the lion's share of the load. But, you know, I still was happy to have you come here and make the case on behalf of your airline.
It isn't just the airline, it's the state and our commitment to the state. There's a reason why there's an Eskimo on that tail. We represent the state and the people within the state.
Ms. Whitcomb?
The only additional comment I would like to make is that earlier in the earlier panel, there was a reference to some concerns with the report that we issued. We provided a response to the concerns that were addressed by the Alaska delegation at the time that report was issued. So that might be of interest.
We'll make sure that's included in the record, since I suspect that you were not in agreement with their position.
Right.
Okay. The last thing is I'm going to ask each of the other potential carriers to submit statements for the record, particularly as to the allegation of safety. I'm going to invite all Alaskan potential carriers of all sort, including Bush pilots, to submit anything they want for the record relative to their ability to safely carry passengers. We will send a letter to the FAA asking about carriers in Alaska. Mr. Butler, if you have concerns about the three potential entrants to the market, if you want to tell us about their safety records and concerns that they would be unsafe for carrying Diet Cokes on the main line, I would appreciate it. Those are areas that obviously our goal is not to disrupt the ability to carry freight in Alaska at an affordable rate. It's just the opposite. It's to try to drive down the cost, not the price, but the cost, since it's being borne by the ratepayer. If there's no other comments I'll keep the record open for 5 days for any of your comments in addition to what I had described. And with that, we stand adjourned.